Allure and death. It is never easy to discuss one's own vulnerabilities, whether that is for the death of your beloved pet, your favorite uncle, or your wife from a malignant cancer. Some deaths are inevitable, and yet others feel less preordained because of the overwhelming sense of the present moment. While it was easy for me not grasp this when I had tried topping myself so many times in my life, somehow when it involves someone else, the feeling puts you in an even greater depression than if you had never met the girl. That feeling of total helplessness, that total lack of the innocuousness, the overwhelming feeling of being the only one left in the world. For me, I was a vampire who lived with a family of humans. You may think I'd let this get to me, but I'm not that kind of girl. If only life could flow like sweet rose metal and not like the thorns. And yet sometimes the rose petals are mixed within that feeling of pain and regret all over again. Sometimes I would see the spirit of the wolf in my dreams and wake up constantly with screams and breathlessness. And I reach out for some hidden hand of a love that is no longer there. Instead, it was the hand of death and despair. The knowledge of the passing of someone you love. The feeling of constantly seeing a lover's execution over and over again. Yet, life never gives you second chances, even when one wants to bring their lover back from the dead. To think instead that the real world treats us like monsters. The villains in old Western movies of young damsels being run over with a train. Yet my mind feels like I walked right into the train tracks from the get-go. My world not letting me die in peace to once again be with my beloved. The feeling of earthly estrangement, drawing nearer and nearer with no end in sight. The feeling of being a pawn in a game of chess. My relationship with Ahina was not the best, nor the worst. It was what we had with indifferent parents, and sometimes the indifference is the worst. What people call a split personality is simply extensive compartmentalization. Everyone does it, some better than others. For me, this manifests as different applications on a local machine. To save me from the websites that make me want to rip out my spleen for life and death, a recount of a story in between. For French girls, my relationships were always different, even from other girls within my class periods. Most other girls I had a vague hope that I could someday love them, but the closest to this I'd ever gotten to a girl from France is to be able to say, "This girl, my friends, is a beautiful girl that I cannot hate." Sometimes it's easy to forget the past, and perhaps that is why I choose to resent the nature of French girls above all over girls from Europe, despite having more negative interactions for those in other places in Europe. But this is like telling an African not to hate a French infantryman when they're under occupation. For me, the interaction was not anything so direct. Rather, it is more in the specifics of not interacting. How we choose to interact with others says much about who we are as a person. How we don't is much the same way. Although it should be noted that my interaction with either Germans or French girls has never been the same as it was in high school. I like girls in Birkenstocks, whether that be Arizona style or the Boston, whether it is them dangling their shoes or other quirks of fetishistic desire. There was a blonde who would do things that tried to get my attention, but I was so stuck in my own personal anxieties that I never considered interacting. Often then meant offhand random phrases about how I never really fit in with punk or goth girls. I danced so far to the beat of my own drummer, I was all the way to the communitarian end. Communitarianism, specifically of the hacktivism variety, a form of libertarianism that focused on communal needs, but in a world where people are stuck within their own individual concerns, even for myself. It was different to even get a word in the face of the onslaught of multiple cars being tossed under to the rhythm of cybernetic motorcycles in total disintegration. Oh shit, now I knew I shouldn't have cropped my hair. She was a different type of voice from Ahina Marie, who stayed in the sidelines, never speaking to anyone. It was almost as if she was a kind of ghost in the class. This was most notable in art class. She was the only one I ever spoke with. Maybe she was a better wordsmith, while I ground invisible axes made by deranged blacksmiths. Hina Marie would always give me a heads up about the girl with the hair color of fairies slaughtered by battle robots, their heads falling off their shoulders, the crimson noticeably from the blue in which it came. Perhaps there was a lot I could go into here, but to be honest, I'm not a Hubzilla or Fremdica profile. This isn't the first draft of somebody's trashy romance novel written on a pop fiction website for hopeless romantics. I may be a hopeless romantic, but I'm not so hopeless as to lower myself to that, while subsequently uploading the same content in which I rant on its very bandwidth to some fan fiction website. It is a story of my own sensuality with everything between love and hate, even if that means it's time to enjoy myself. Because we all do it. All this to say, French girls had their own allure. For Ahina Marie, this allure was in death. You can read the webcomic variety of this story at uploadedfury.thecomicseries.com. What they call loneliness. What they call loneliness in the world of the net is really a symptom of addiction. Some call it addiction to the social life, despite all the evidence to the contrary based on its unsociableness. The symptoms are a manifestation of a larger disease more toxic than humane than the flesh for blood and decapitation. For me, I find as I move toward using more federated networks, I find that I can actually get more actual interactions that I need, that I've never received anywhere else. But on some level, this is a mechanism of coping, not unlike the girl on the street who is doping, yet not third world enough to grant sympathy. One of the main issues some may call self-fulfilling prophecy, although I simply call it being realistic, is how it seems like you never really can rely on Europeans to teach you the language. This is especially the case among girls of that country. There seems to be this unspoken rule that if someone mentions wanting to learn a language, then maybe it's a good idea to say, in a false, promising way, "Oh, maybe I can show you one of mine." But then you just kind of know, like people from Seattle, the reason they never really think through it is their tendency to be flakes. This isn't an issue of political correctness. It's just an observation about how French people seem to treat people of American heritage. This was one of the reasons I wasn't sure whether I really felt comfortable meeting Ahina Marie. Although ultimately there were other issues that made whether or not French people were reliable at much of anything largely a moot point. Because you were the only two who trusted each other enough just to get by in this strange world, a world where a French girl doesn't get along with her own country and an American with hers. Ultimately, it becomes a very toxic game of hate fucking and anti-desire. It consumes you in entire, like being ran over with tires. Splatter, pop goes the weasel. Boombox bursting the voice box. radio nights dreaming, skeleton man screaming, dreaming of another time when one could break up far sooner. And yet there is something else, something to make you hold on. I've had issues with blonde girls ever since I met the one French-American and Spanish-American girls back in 5th grade. The impression I had gotten was that, in general, while both Latinas hated attractive people, although don't mistake this for assuming I consider myself thus, they both liked ugly men. There were several reasons why this was an issue, but let's first begin with the statement and judgment we call ugly. In American contemporary usage, and this permeates across various fields of life, including fashion, the word ugly carries the meaning of being unattractive. The word homely began being used in the same way during another era, although it originally meant someone I want to take home with me. It didn't seem like there was enough of their immigrant background for them to not realize the very American context. It was one thing for Bianca to treat me this way, as I had once confused her for a Mexican. Kids say that kind of stupid shit all the time. But with Stephanie, there was no possible way for her to think I was confusing her for anybody. It was a grudge I had hidden for all the years of my life. Around the same issue, blonde girls, which Stephanie was almost, became increasingly associated with bitchy behavior. Doubled with the fact that one girl I knew in high school essentially rejected me using my best friend as a proxy. It wasn't that I wouldn't have accepted being rejected, but rather I was already dealing with gender issues, often being referred to as feminine. Apparently I was so feminine, like one of the girls, that Emma decided to reject me in a backhanded fashion, highlighting some of her own issues. Mom was also becoming increasingly narcissistic at the time, and it all set the stage for my issue with blonde girls with cat-eye glasses. I was prepared to think of French girls as one way and not the other way that turned out to be incorrect. But then, and why I jokingly referred to them as Latinas, was what set the stage for the other misunderstanding allowed me to be victimized by my ex. There was a book website I read a long time ago that labeled France as being Latino. I already had developed issues about Latino girls based on my limited interaction with Spanish girls, and why I chose for many years not to learn Spanish, due to associating the language with flamenco and whatever genre of song the word La Paloma was, which was later adopted across the Latin American and European world, and was beloved by the Belgian princess. As someone who had for many years hated folk music, it made me that much more determined to hate Spanish things. As someone who was willing to give French girls a chance and having been somewhat of a Francophile to begin with, ultimately everything seemed to come to a head. I felt totally betrayed because I liked French girls. I wanted to reject all Romance languages. My ex, whom I had known in trans support group, emotionally manipulated these issues further and wanted to manipulate me into being something of a Francophobe. I took that at the strength I had, but I also had a darker secret.